Welcome to week 4 of Kingdom Hearts. We are looking at the Sermon on the Mount right there in Matthew chapter 5. We started off with the Beatitudes with kingdom characteristics. Now we've moved into having God's heart for the law, having God's heart for how we should react to the culture, how we should react to the world around us. We need to have God's heart on every matter. And so you're going to see it a lot. You've heard it said, but I say. And so he's talking to primarily a Jewish audience. He's talking to his disciples, and then there's people that are actually listening in around him. But the law was very important in Jewish culture. And so now he's taking phrases right out of the law of Moses, and then he's saying, okay, but let me explain it to you in the way that you should have a heart for this. Don't just do it, but have a heart for it, as Pastor Mike said in his message before. And so we want to look at this. So now we're in week 4. We're going to look at kind of a light topic: lust, adultery, and divorce. Nothing too controversial there. And to add to the matter, let's talk about the pandemic too, right? Let's talk about masks and the efficacy of masks, or maybe not. Actually, I do want to talk about masks for a second, because my wife, in the beginning of the pandemic, started to make masks because there was a shortage of masks, and so she started to sew some. And she went to, what's that fabric store? Joann's. She went to Joann's, and they were rationing out fabric because so many people were going in to make masks for the pandemic, because we didn't know if we were going to have some, and so she wanted to make some for the first responders. But the funny thing is, it got down to it to where we're buying like the thinnest fabric you could find. And I'm like, okay, this stuff is not even going to be useful, right? But nevertheless, we made it anyways, because there was no real standard on which type of mask was required. They just said masks required. And so you saw people going in with like sheer masks, and nobody said anything, because it's like, well, I guess that's all you could find, right? And so I thought it would be funny to say, okay, let's take the mask required thing and apply it to something else. I said, how about the helmet law? There's a standard for the kind of helmet you're supposed to wear, right? And so I said, what if I decided I'm going to make Etsy homemade helmets and sell them online, and I'm going to make them out of milk jugs, right? I mean, it's the same kind of idea, right? You're buying this thin fabric that doesn't really do anything and making a mask out of it, so why can't I make a helmet out of a milk jug? And so I actually took a milk jug, washed it out, cut it up. Here's a picture of it right here. And so I said, I'm going to post this and say, hey, I'm selling milk jug helmets for those who can't find helmets right now. And my wife's like, don't post that. That's going to be ridiculous. But so now it's out there. But the idea is, it's not just the law that matters. It's the reason for the law that matters. It's the heart of the matter. You have to look at the helmet and say, well, the reason the helmet law is in place is because they don't want you to die when you fall off your motorcycle or your bike. And so there needs to be a level of protection. We need to look at the kind of helmet that you're supposed to be wearing. You don't want to just wear a milk jug helmet. And so in a sense, when we look at lust and adultery, and then later on divorce in the passage, Jesus is saying, hey, look, don't wear a milk jug helmet. I want to tell you really what the requirement is, and I want to get to the root of why this is in the law. And so we're going to pick up here in Matthew chapter 5, and I don't have a title for this message, so let's just call it hashtag milk jug helmet. How about that? Matthew chapter 5, 27 through 32, it says this. You've heard it said, like I said, you're going to hear this a lot. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. Okay, right there, he's quoting Exodus 20. Right out of the 10 Commandments. You shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body to be thrown into hell. Verse 30. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than it is for your whole body to go to hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. And so now he's quoting Deuteronomy 23, right out of the law. And then it says in verse 32, but I say to you, so you've heard it said in Deuteronomy 24, but I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her, that's interesting, he makes her commit adultery, and whomever marries a divorced woman commits adultery himself. Okay, big block of very weighty stuff there. And so I want to break it down into 3 points for us because we only have 15 minutes. So we're not going to get an entire discussion and comprehensive teaching on adultery, lust, and divorce, especially divorce. I mean, you could look at Matthew chapter 19, you could go back to Genesis, you could bounce all over the Bible to get, and you can go to 1 Corinthians to get a comprehensive teaching on God's requirement on divorce. But I want to touch on just one aspect of it, and that is in relation to adultery, because that's what he's talking about here. He's leading out of adultery into divorce, and then how divorce relates to adultery. And so 3 points. The first point is this: don't confuse your woes. Don't confuse your woes. Okay, I'm going to put the word woe because we're going to use a few different types of woes here. So there's the word woe right there. Don't confuse your woes. You're like, what does that mean? Here's an example. If you see an attractive woman, there is a big difference between you going, whoa, and you going, whoa. You don't want to confuse those two things. Whoa is the good one. Whoa is the bad one. There's an idea that if you're being tempted and you notice that something is a temptation, oh, great, I've committed adultery already. No. It's how it passes through your eyes and hits your heart and your mind that matters, right? And so if you see an attractive woman or women, if you see a Pastor Mike, an attractive guy, I know it's hard, he's very dreamy, blue eyes. Anyways, if you see that and you go, whoa, I recognize that this might be a problem. I recognize that that's an attractive person, but I'm married. Or if you're not married yet and you don't want to fall into lust, you're just like, I recognize, okay, that's a beautiful person, but I need to have God's heart on the matter. So, whoa, got to back off. But it becomes sin when it passes the temptation into, I'm going to entertain this. So it's like, whoa, it's very attractive. And then you start to entertain these things. That's not what you should be doing. So again, number 1, don't confuse your woes. Number 2 is you need to discard your woes. Okay, here's the other kind of woes. It's W-O-E-S, right there, woes. You need to discard your woes. And so if we look back, after he says, but I say to you, anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You've confused your woes. But then he says in verse 29, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. And then in verse 30, he says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. And so you need to discard your woes. The things that are going to cause you to sin, the things that are going to entrap you and go beyond that temptation to actually committing the sin of lust and adultery in your heart, you need to discard those things because they are woes. They are problems for you. And so we look at this and we're like, do I literally have to cut out my eye? Well, that's not what he's saying. It's a figurative thing. He's saying anything that will draw you into sin. And so let's give it a practical application here. If scrolling through Instagram causes you to sin, causes you to go, whoa, it might be just better just to delete Instagram off your phone, right? If watching Netflix and certain scenes come on causes you to lust and to sin, it's better for you to just turn off Netflix or just cancel Netflix or whatever other streaming services. I mean, the list goes on. Now, I realize we can't live this super monastic life. You're going to be driving around. You're going to see billboards. There's going to be stuff that's thrown in your face. But to the best of your ability, harness what Jesus is saying here. Cut those woes out of your life. You don't need to just have something there to tempt you that isn't necessary, right? I mean, you could just cut it out. And so you need to discard your woes. And notice also, he says your right eye and your right hand. That's considered the strong hand. You know, you want to sit at the right hand of honor. You want to sit at the right hand of God. That's where the power is. That's where the influence is. So your right eye, and he's saying, even if it's something that you love, even if it's going to cost you what you consider to be a little bit of strength, because I know what it is. It's like, well, Yeah, I just won't watch the bad stuff on Netflix, right? I really want to see how Stranger Things turns out because I really love it. It's going to cost you something. It's going to cost you strength. He says it's better for one of your members to be cut off than your whole body to be thrown into hell. Even if it costs you something, it's important for you to discard those woes. All right, and so then point number 3. So point number 1, just to recap, don't confuse your woes. Whoa. And discard your woes. Cut it off, get rid of it. And then number 3, divorce is woe. Divorce is woe. So there are 7 things recorded in the Bible that God hates. The first 6 of them are found in Proverbs 6, 16 through 19. You can go and read it if you have a chance. But in Malachi 2:16, it says God hates divorce. So I make every morning a really, really good breakfast sandwich. I get a little egg over easy, sometimes over medium, some salt and pepper, avocado, a high fiber English muffin because I'm old and I need that, and then some apples and stuff. And it's just a really well balanced breakfast, and it's super delicious and healthy for you. And one of my friends said, "Oh, you know what you ought to try is chorizo. Chorizo's delicious." And he is, in fact, wrong about that. Chorizo's disgusting. I don't like chorizo. I hate chorizo. Well, good news for us Christians. God also hates chorizo. Now, okay, not the Mexican meat chorizo, but he hates divorce. So the Greek word used in all throughout the New Testament, and then the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It uses this word chorizo. It's actually spelled chorizo, but it's actually pronounced chorizo. But I think it's funny to say, hey, God hates chorizo, right? And so the word divorce that's used there is, if you translate it out, is a willful severing of a covenant. So severing of a covenant. We often look at it, especially in our culture today, as a severing of a contract. You know, when somebody wants to get a divorce, what is the first thing they do? They call a lawyer, someone who argues the law, right? And so we'll look at assets and divide up assets, and we'll say, okay, what is the reason you want to get divorced? And the top reason is always irreconcilable differences, right? You always hear that. Like, well, that's kind of bad because my wife and I have irreconcilable differences, but that's not going to lead us to divorce. I love coffee. Now, this is kind of superfluous, but I love coffee. My wife does not love coffee. She will never love coffee. That is a difference that will never be reconciled. And so there are levels, obviously, and there are issues that you will have, but God's law has a lot to say about it. And it says, do not commit adultery. And then it says, God hates divorce. And so we don't want to be after God's heart when we're doing something that God hates. It's just not something we should do. I read an article in Reader's Digest. Actually, I read it online, readersdigest.com. Does anybody actually get Reader's Digest anymore? Like, I don't know. Anyway. And it said the 12 interesting reasons that people divorce, and I thought it was pretty funny. One of them, in 2009, a German woman filed for divorce after her husband knocked down and rebuilt a wall in their home because he said it got too dirty. And so she divorced him for that. Irreconcilable differences. How about this one? Voted out. A lot of divorces actually happened in this last election cycle. She found out that her husband voted for Donald J. Trump and felt betrayed, and so she divorced him for that. Pretty interesting. And then another woman actually divorced her husband because he divorced her first. So she got mad. They're arguing. Apparently they had gotten remarried, and so she got mad because he divorced her first. I thought that was pretty funny. Another woman divorced her husband because it turns out he was just too nice all the time. She couldn't handle him being so nice all the time. And so we have all these different reasons that you show up on a contract of why you're divorcing. But it's very important. Marriage was not designed by man. It is not a contract. Even though you have to go down to City Hall and write up a contract and change your name and stuff like that, that's a modern invention. Marriage was instituted by God. It is a representation of Christ's love for the church on earth. And so, is there any surprise that God would hate when that is severed? You're severing a covenant, not just between you and your wife or you and your husband, but you and God. And so God hates it because he would never do it. He wants to love you perfectly. And like I said, we're not going to get a complete comprehensive idea of allowances for divorce. That's not what we're here to do today. But I do think it is interesting that in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, it says, "But I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except for grounds of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." And so when we're looking at this idea of divorce in relation to adultery, we need to remember that adultery is not merely just an act, but it's also a trap. It's a trap of the enemy. And if you sever your covenant with your wife, maybe you're abandoning them, or in the inverse, if you sever your covenant with your husband, you are not only committing the sin of chorizo. Some of you are like, I'll commit chorizo to my stomach, but I won't commit the sin of chorizo. Bad joke. You're not only committing the sin of divorce, but now you're causing another person to commit adultery if they remarry, which is a very interesting thing. And so God cares very deeply about our relationship on earth that mirrors his relationship with his church. You notice in James and in other epistles, anytime the writer in Greek uses the word you adulterous people, it actually is in the feminine. It says you adulteress says. Anytime that we're finding strife between God and his followers, the word adulteress says in the feminine is used there. So in a sense, we are the church, the bride of Christ. And so when we are severing our covenant with God by sinning against him, we are actually, the word that he uses there is adulteresses. And so it is the strongest sense of the word for betrayal of God and his church. And so it's no surprise that Jesus would highlight here that adultery in marriage is the highest sense of betrayal between us and our wives, or us and our husbands. And so I'm going to leave it there. But just to recap, number one, don't confuse your woes. Whoa. And discard your woes. Get rid of those things that are going to cause you to stumble, to lust, and to commit adultery in your heart. And then divorce is woe. There are no irreconcilable differences. I know Jesus says except for sexual immorality, but I'll tell you this much. I've seen marriages come back from the brink, even having grounds for divorce, even having biblical reasons for them to separate. It's always better when they reconcile. It is always better when they reconcile. And I will say this, God hates divorce. But if you've been through a divorce, I want to make it abundantly clear, God does not hate you. He doesn't hate you. He hates divorce, but he does not hate you. And he will forgive you. But we should avoid it at all costs. And so, again, adultery, lust, divorce, all things we need to keep our woes in check, because we don't want to be wearing a milk jug helmet.